They would talk about that night for years, the moment a duke crossed a line no nobleman had ever dared to cross, when silence swallowed an entire ballroom and power shifted without a single command being spoken. But at the beginning, before the whispers and the scandal and the quiet, irreversible change, she was nothing more than a shadow at the edge of the room, a girl no one noticed, a maid who understood better than anyone that the world of nobility was built on invisible walls, and that her place was firmly, unchangeably outside them. Clara Whitlow had learned that lesson early, long before she ever set foot inside Ashbourne House, long before she ever stood beneath chandeliers that glittered like captured stars, long before she felt the weight of 100 judging eyes without a single one truly seeing her. Because girls like Clara were not meant to be seen. They were meant to serve, to move quietly through corridors and halls, to anticipate needs before they were spoken to, lower their gaze and make themselves small enough that they became part of the background, as unnoticed as the polished floors they scrubbed or the silver trays they carried. And Clara had been very good at that. So good, in fact, that most people in the household could not have described her if asked, despite passing her daily. She was efficient, quiet, obedient, everything a maid should be, and nothing more, which was precisely why she had been chosen to carry a message that evening, a simple task that should have taken no more than a few minutes, a quick delivery to the steward before retreating back to the servants' wing where she belonged, far from the grand gathering unfolding in the main ballroom. But nothing about that night unfolded the way it should have, because when Clara reached the threshold of the great hall, she hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough for everything to change, drawn in by the sheer spectacle of it. The music, the light, the swirl of silks and satin, the low murmur of voices that carried confidence and power in every word. And though she knew better, though every instinct told her to turn away immediately, she found herself standing there, just inside the doorway, clutching the folded note in her hand, caught between worlds she could never bridge. The ballroom was alive in a way she had never experienced, filled with people who moved as though they owned not only the space but the very air within it, their laughter effortless, their posture perfect, their lives so distant from hers that it might as well have been another universe. And Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that quiet reminder of her place, of the fact that no matter how close she stood, she did not belong, could never belong. And so she tried to slip along the edge of the room, to remain unnoticed as she searched for the steward among the sea of finely dressed figures. But it was difficult not to feel exposed in a space like this, where every detail mattered, where her plain uniform stood in stark contrast to embroidered gowns and tailored coats, where even the air seemed colder against her skin, as though the room itself rejected her presence. Still, no one stopped her, no one spoke to her, no one even glanced her way, and that should have comforted her, should have allowed her to complete her task and leave without incident. But instead it made her feel smaller, more invisible than ever, as though she were nothing more than a ghost drifting through a world that did not acknowledge her existence. And perhaps she would have remained exactly that, a passing shadow in a grand room, if not for the sudden shift that rippled through the crowd without warning, subtle at first, like a change in the wind, conversations faltering just slightly, laughter softening, attention turning almost instinctively toward the far end of the hall where the massive doors had begun to open. And Clara, despite herself, looked up, drawn by the movement, by the collective awareness that something, or rather, someone, important had arrived. She did not need to be told who it was, did not need to hear a name spoken, because the reaction alone was enough to tell her everything. The way people straightened, the way space seemed to form naturally in anticipation, the way the entire room aligned itself toward that entrance as though governed by an unseen force. And when he stepped inside, the effect was immediate and undeniable, a presence that did not demand attention but commanded it all the same. The Duke of Ashbourne, a man whose reputation had long since solidified into something almost mythic within the household, spoken of in hushed tones among the staff, respected, feared, never questioned, a man who was said to be as cold as he was powerful, as distant as he was precise. And as Clara watched him move through the crowd, acknowledging greetings with the barest inclination of his head, She understood why, because there was something about him that set him apart even in a room full of nobility, something controlled, something unyielding, something that made it clear he did not exist on the same level as those around him, and certainly not on hers. She should have looked away, should have lowered her gaze as she had been taught. But for reasons she could not quite explain, she didn't. And that was her first mistake, because in the next moment, something impossible happened. He stopped, not in the center of the room among his equals, not beside those who held rank and title, but somewhere near the edge, somewhere close enough that Clara felt a sudden, inexplicable tension settle over her, as though the air itself had tightened. And then, slowly, deliberately, his gaze shifted, moving across the space until it landed on the one place it should never have gone. The one place no one of his standing had any reason to look, and when his eyes met hers, everything else seemed to fall away. The music, the voices, the movement, all fading into a distant hum as a single, impossible truth took hold. He was looking at her, not past her, not through her, but directly at her, seeing her in a way no one else ever had. And in that instant, Clara Whitlow, the invisible maid, the girl who had built her entire existence around not being noticed, realized with a jolt of quiet, rising panic that she had just become the center of a room that had never once acknowledged her presence, and that whatever happened next would not be something she could simply disappear from. The moment stretched unbearably, thin as glass and just as fragile, and Clara felt it pressing in on her from all sides. The silence, the attention, the impossible awareness that she had somehow become the center of a room that had never once acknowledged her existence. And every instinct she had screamed at her to lower her gaze, to step back, to disappear before this turned into something worse. But she could not move, could not think, because he was already walking toward her, each measured step echoing far too loudly in the hush that had fallen, drawing every eye along with him, binding the entire ballroom to this single, unfolding moment. She dropped her gaze at last, her fingers tightening around the note in her hand as though it could anchor her to something real, something normal. But nothing about this was normal, nothing about the way the Duke of Ashbourne had looked at her, directly, deliberately, made any sense. And when he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the quiet authority of his presence without even looking up, her breath caught, her voice unsteady when he spoke. "Why are you standing here without proper attire?" The question simple, almost mild, and yet it struck her harder than any reprimand, because it acknowledged her in a way that made her visible to everyone else, and she struggled to answer. I was delivering a message, my lord. I didn't mean to intrude." The words sounding smaller than she intended, shrinking beneath the weight of listening years, and for a brief second she thought that would be the end of it, that he would dismiss her, allow the moment to dissolve so she could retreat back into invisibility where she belonged. But instead he paused, his silence unreadable, and then, without warning, he reached for his coat. The movement alone sent a ripple through the room, subtle but unmistakable, because it was not something a man like him did without purpose, and Clara's confusion deepened as he removed it. The finely tailored fabric catching the light, unmistakably noble, unmistakably his, and before she could make sense of it, before she could even step back, he placed it around her shoulders, the warmth immediate, startling, the weight of it settling over her like something unreal, something that did not belong to her life. The ballroom fell into a deeper silence then, heavy and absolute, as though no one quite knew how to react, because no one dared question him, and no one dared acknowledge her. And Clara stood frozen beneath the sudden attention, her heart racing, her thoughts scattering as she tried to understand what this meant, what she was meant to do, because this was not a kindness she could quietly accept, not something that could pass unnoticed. And when he spoke again, his voice as calm as ever, it only made it more surreal. "You are cold," he said, as though that alone explained everything, as though the act carried no weight beyond the obvious, and Clara's lips parted. But no words came, because there was nothing she could say that would not make this moment larger, more real, more dangerous, and so she remained where she was, wrapped in his coat, caught in a silence no one dared to break, knowing with a quiet certainty that nothing about her place in that room, or in the world beyond it, would ever be quite the same again. For a long moment, nothing moved, as though the entire ballroom had forgotten how to breathe, and in that silence, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone present. Not loudly, not chaotically, but with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, because the Duke did not take back what he had done, did not offer explanation or apology, did not even glance around to measure the reaction he had caused, and that, more than anything, made it clear that this had not been a mistake. Instead, he simply shifted his stance, subtle yet unmistakable, placing himself beside Clara rather than apart from her. And though he did not touch her again, the message was already understood, his presence alone enough to redraw the invisible lines that governed the room, and Clara felt it happen in real time. The change, the shift in how she was seen, not as an equal, not as someone who suddenly belonged, but no longer as something that could be dismissed entirely, because association, even silent, carried power. Her heart still raced beneath the borrowed warmth of his coat, her thoughts unsteady as she became aware of the way the nobles now looked at her, no longer through her, but at her, cautious, uncertain, as though unsure how to behave in the presence of something that defied the rules they had always relied upon. And it was that uncertainty that spread first, quiet and subtle, a hesitation in movement, a pause in conversation, until at last the Duke's voice cut cleanly. Through it, calm and controlled. "Music," he said, and the spell broke at once, the orchestra resuming with a jolt, conversations rising again, softer at first, then steadier, as though the room itself were attempting to recover from something it could not quite name. But the change lingered beneath it all, woven into every glance and gesture. Clara did not move, did not dare to, standing exactly where he had left her, wrapped in something that was never meant for her, feeling the space around her differently now, as though it had expanded in ways she could not yet understand. And when, at last, the Duke turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shifting crowd as though nothing unusual had occurred, he did not look back, did not call for his coat, did not undo what had been done. And that, perhaps, was what made it real, what made it permanent, because there would be no returning to what had been before, not for her, not for the room, not for anyone who had witnessed it. And, though no one spoke of it aloud, though the music continued and the night carried on as it must, every person present understood the same quiet truth, that something had changed in that moment, something small and yet undeniable, and from that night forward, Clara Whitlow would never again be entirely invisible.